Alright, what's up everybody? I'm coming back to you here with another Epstein video, and I just wanted to let you guys know that there's some very good evidence that our politicians and our leaders and many other people are actually successfully being blackmailed by foreign countries. Now, there's a lot going on here with the Epstein story in general, right? We have the pedophile stuff, we have the money laundering, potential arms trafficking, on and on and on. But this whole thing with our country losing its sovereignty because some degenerate piece of shit collected a whole bunch of compromising information on a bunch of people in like the 90s and the 2000s early on, and even like the 2010s to a large extent too, that's pretty scary stuff. So let's go through it real quick. The first thing I'm going to establish is that Epstein did indeed have intelligence connections. If we look back to the 1980s, Epstein met his partner, Ghislaine Maxwell, although I don't really know if partner is the right term, given that she was somewhere between a girlfriend and a wife, or maybe just a sex slave, or who the hell really knows what Ghislaine Maxwell was. She seemed to me to be like some kind of emotional support dog. But that's not the point here. The point is that her father was this guy, Robert Maxwell. And many countries considered Robert Maxwell to be something called a super spy, which is somebody that spies on behalf of like 3 or more countries or something. Apparently a bunch of countries thought he had connections to MI6, the KGB, as well as Mossad out of Israel. And for those of you who have been following the Epstein story, you know that this guy died in a very strange fashion. He basically dropped dead on the edge of his boat, plunged into the sea, and was found days later. Something that does sound like a hit job when you look into the details. But let's move on. We also have Epstein's partner back in the early 90s, who set up one of the largest Ponzi schemes to date in America through the Tower Financial Corporation with a guy named Stephen Hoffenberg. Now, it's important for you to know that Stephen Hoffenberg felt quite burned by Epstein after the whole thing fell through. The SEC and the FBI came in and did an investigation, but at the end of the day, Epstein got off completely scot-free, even though Stephen Hoffenberg and everybody else at the executive level in that company ended up in prison. So as Epstein was flying into the sunset, Stephen had some interesting remarks to make about Epstein. He was telling everybody that Epstein had major traction with the Department of Justice, and that he was basically his uncharged co-conspirator in the whole scheme. But another interesting thing that Stephen said was that Epstein often bragged about passing along very compromising secret information about people like Prince Andrew to, guess who? Mossad, which again is the intelligence agency of Israel. Okay, so that's 2 points so far. Now I want to show you guys something that I dug up personally in the Volume 8 release, which was the last release given to us by the government. I found this email between a guy named Melvin Cohn and Mark Epstein, which is Epstein's brother. In this email, Melvin is telling Mark Epstein that his brother Jeffrey Epstein is doing the Jewish community a lot of harm, that Epstein is bringing a lot of bad press to the Jewish community. And one example of how Epstein was doing this, given by Melvin, was that Epstein was operating in very close proximity to both North Korean and Chinese arms dealers. People who were selling lots of weaponry to North Korea and China and for North Korea and China. Okay? So he was very deeply involved in all kinds of arms trafficking that inevitably led to mass death and murder. So that's a third reason why we can believe that Epstein was tied in with intelligence communities. The fourth and final reason why I say Epstein was in fact ingrained with these intelligence agencies is that we know for a fact, thanks to the guys over at DropSite, that Epstein had used his resources to broker a security agreement between the governments of Mongolia and Israel. This is a huge deal. This is not something that normal people are capable of doing. This is not something that big money people are capable of doing. This is something that only people who are very, very deep into the political world and the world of security and defense are going to be engaging in, okay? So yes, Epstein was deeply, deeply involved with government intelligence agencies throughout the world. And I want to stress that point because this video is about blackmail, and we think about who would potentially be buying blackmail material. More than likely, intelligence agencies of other countries. So now that we have that established, let's establish something else. Let's establish the fact that Epstein was in the habit of using blackmail material. As somebody who was trying to sell blackmail, Epstein very likely would have been using this himself. And not only would he have benefited from the use of the blackmail, but it also would have made him a better salesman of that blackmail. He would know just how effective it really was, and he would have something to show for it. Almost like a little successful blackmail portfolio. So let's look at some cases in which we know, or we can speculate, that Epstein did in fact use blackmail. The first instance we know of is Bill Gates. Bill Gates had an affair with a Russian bridge player, which is some kind of little tabletop game that they play, and Epstein found out about it and tried to use this to compel Bill Gates to engage in a deal which would have made Epstein a lot of money. Moving on to the second point, we have Leon Black. Leon Black was the CEO of Apollo Global before the whole Epstein thing blew up. And in this instance, we see the evidence for blackmail in something called the Degenerate report, which is a report that was made by a company called Degenerate LLP, who were hired by Apollo Global to come in and do a third-party review that was supposed to be unbiased. They say that they found a couple of very interesting things. The first thing that they found that was very interesting was that there was a lot of disputes over whether Epstein had actually come up with the ideas that were cited for the reason for Epstein being paid $170 million over a couple of years by Leon Black. If I recall correctly, there were two different tax strategies that were cited as the reason for Epstein's massive payment. And here we see that a lot of people within Apollo Global were disputing that Epstein had come up with those ideas. The second thing that the Degenerate report shows us is that there was emails between Leon Black and Epstein in which it looks like Epstein was breaching the subject of some kind of blackmail material. He was alluding to potentially referencing personal matters that Leon Black had shared with Epstein in confidence. Now, why Epstein would be bringing up stuff like that in strictly business emails, I don't know. But it does make a lot of sense if he was trying to blackmail Leon, of course. In the Degenerate report, they frame this as Epstein invoking his friendship in order to push this deal through and so that Epstein can get paid. Anyways, moving on, we're going to look at Leslie Wexner. Wexner has long been seen as somebody who was blackmailed by Epstein. Leslie Wexner is the guy who basically gave away his $80 million penthouse in New York. This is probably one of the most expensive properties, and at one point, for the longest time, was the most expensive property in all of New York City. It really does appear as though Leslie Wexner just gave this property to Epstein. Not only that, but we also know that Leslie Wexner gave his 727 commercial jet, owned by his company, The Limited, to Epstein through a number of Shell Corporation handoffs. This is the plane that would end up becoming known as the Lolita Express. And we're all still wondering why Leslie Wexner would give a guy like Epstein an $80 million penthouse and a $5 million commercial jet, along with everything else that Leslie Wexner did, like giving him complete power of attorney over his fortunes and completely overlooking Epstein's bad behavior that endangered the reputations of his companies. Still, to this day, nobody knows why Leslie Wexner actually did any of this. Moving on to our third point, we have a man named Mortimer Zuckerman. Mortimer wrote Epstein a very cryptic letter back in the early 2000s. It was featured in the 50th birthday book released by Congress. This letter basically served as a very subtle threat towards Epstein, and it reads like a counter threat, in all honesty, in which if Epstein had potentially been attempting to blackmail Mortimer Zuckerman for some reason, Mortimer wrote this letter in which he references very specific events, including Epstein's 38th birthday and the country of Liechtenstein. Because when Epstein was 38 years old, that's the year Robert Maxwell died. And Liechtenstein is the company where Robert Maxwell would push all of his money through that he stole from the pension funds of his corporations so that he could have next to no transparency when pushing them into his family trusts. Family trusts, which would likely still be used by people like Ghislaine Maxwell or Epstein himself back in 2003. We also know that Mortimer Zuckerman did visit Epstein's New York townhouse on at least one occasion. And coming up very soon here, I'm going to show you why that's so important. But let's move on to our next and last individual, a man by the name of Glenn Dubin. Glenn here was accused by Virginia Giuffre of sexual assault, which, if true, would give Epstein complete ability to blackmail Glenn Dubin. Now, do we know if Epstein actually acted on this and blackmailed Glenn? Well, potentially. We have a $15 million fee that Epstein was awarded for, quote, smoothing over the sale of a $1.3 billion stake in Glenn's company Highbridge Capital Management, which is a hedge fund, to JP Morgan. And as we know, Epstein also had strong contacts, such as Jess Staley over at JP Morgan. This is how Epstein was making a huge chunk of his money, everybody. He would come in and he would negotiate between all these people that he likely had blackmail on, and he would ensure that everybody complied and came to a deal in which he would collect a $15 million or more, in the case of Leon Black, fee for, quote, smoothing over the deal. But how did he master the dark arts and become a wizard of black magic? Well, let me show you some other stuff now. In 2006, there was a detective in Palm Beach, Florida. His name was Joe Recarey. Joe Recarey served a search warrant of Epstein's property during Epstein's first investigation, in which over 40 young girls were accusing him of sexually assaulting them. And here is some of what Joe found in Epstein's Palm Beach residence. He found audio tapes, micro tapes, copies of all those tapes. He found cassette players, Sony micro cassettes, and all kinds of other recording devices. Now you can see for some reason the DOJ decided to redact Joe Recarey's name from these documents. But here I found also in the latest release, Joe Recarey's original search warrant seizure list, in which his name is printed at the bottom. Now, interestingly enough, this detective, Joe Recarey, who likely heard a lot of what was on those tapes, has died. He actually died back in 2018, about exactly 1 year before Epstein's arrest in 2019, the next year. And I personally find it interesting that Joe's death got literally no media coverage, being as that he was one of the most important investigators in Epstein's 2006 investigation, the one where he got that super corrupt non-prosecution agreement deal, if you guys remember that. But when it comes to people that have died in the Epstein story, it's always weird. So we're just going to go ahead and move on from that. And we're going to move on to Epstein's New York property, where we see a number of very interesting things as well. It was at some point in 2020 or something, I believe, that the FBI gave us this list of items that they found at Epstein's New York townhouse. It's important to know that after Epstein's conviction and sentence in Florida, Epstein was conducting most of his business at this New York townhouse until his arrest in 2019, which was almost 10 years. But let me just go through some of the stuff that Epstein had in this townhouse. We see things like USBs, Olympus handheld recording devices, Unify cloud keys, Unify video and network video recorders, numerous different server units, including an HP server with 4 500 gigabyte drives, linear tape operator Generation 6 cartridges, which are very extreme backup devices that store stuff on tape, and other server units with tons and tons of storage, and tons of other network video recorder and digital video recorder, NVR, DVR recording technology, where many cameras would lead back to in the offices of his property. This is the one at his New York townhouse, and this is the one that was at Little St. James Island. And if you're wondering, how did Epstein set all this stuff up? Because this is an extremely elaborate blackmail collection, dissemination, and distribution system. He likely had help from a company called Carbine, which was an Israeli startup that Epstein had put about $1 million into through a shell corporation and Ehud Barak back in 2015. I found out that despite Carbine being just a Israeli startup on the other side of the world, within a year it had an office put up in New York City, just 2 miles away from Epstein's New York townhouse, the one with all of this stuff. And maybe you're asking, well, what does Carbine do? What do they have to do with any of this? Well, they are a company that does exactly the same thing, just for a different reason. They are a company which assists 911 dispatch by using cameras, audio recorders, gunshot detectors, all manners of detection devices, and packaging that information up and sending it off to dispatch units. It also allows these dispatch units to then send it on to the first responders in a very timely and efficient manner, as well as tertiary places like hospitals or shelters where that information may be needed as well. And I do find it very suspicious that Epstein had gone ahead and invested in this, about $1 million. Ehud Barak became the chairman, and then they set up an office just 2 miles away from Epstein's New York townhouse in New York. And it's my personal suspicion that Epstein had at least one person coming out there from that office to his New York townhouse to set this whole network up, because this is a pretty complicated blackmail harvesting system. Okay, but moving on from Carbine now, I want to show you guys what really got me worried about this whole potential sale of blackmail information to foreign countries. I started looking at the pictures of Epstein's New York townhouse where they found all this stuff. Take a look at this image first. Does this look like something that you would see at any normal person's house? Because it doesn't to me. What this looks like to me is a security surveillance setup, something that takes in information from a lot of different cameras all at once, and you can select which video feeds you want going at any one time, which video feeds you want to record, and then you can compile them in some kind of video processing software and then save them digitally. But here's where it gets very concerning. Take a look at this image. Off to the right, you'll see packing peanuts and large FedEx boxes. This is where I started getting really concerned. We see that Epstein was potentially sending things out to people. He was potentially packaging up hard drives, USBs, CDs, whatever else, and potentially sending them to anybody. In this image, we see more of that stuff. We see rolls of packing paper. Those rolls that you're seeing right there are used for packaging delicate materials. You unroll the paper, you rip off a piece, and you crunch it up and you put it in the box, and it provides for some cushioning inside the box. In the top right, we see packing tape so that they can tape up the boxes that they're sending out. In this image, we see a whole bunch of organizers for a lot of peripheral and accessory technology components, but we also see envelopes. At the top center, we see large envelopes, and then off to the left, we see smaller envelopes. Now, these envelopes could easily have fit a USB drive or a CD or any kind of other small device capable of storing digital information, such as the numerous hard drives that they found not just at his New York townhouse, but also Little St. James Island. How hard do you guys think it would be to load one of these bad boys up with a whole bunch of blackmail information and then ship that to somebody either here in the United States or in a foreign country and collect a whole bunch of money for that? Because I think it's extremely likely that that's exactly what was going on. In fact, we even have proof from some of the recently released emails that Jeffrey Epstein was offering images of Donald Trump to a journalist, in which Donald Trump was hanging out with girls in bikinis at Jeffrey Epstein's Palm Beach mansion. All right, so we see that Epstein did have connections to intelligence agencies of foreign countries. We also see that Epstein did engage in blackmail behavior. He was very familiar with the usefulness that blackmail provided. And now we see that as early as 2006 at Epstein's Florida residence, he was collecting blackmail. I mean, who has that many Sony micro cassette recorders? It was like a dozen of them. Who collects that many recording devices? And then we basically see the second generation of the same thing in his New York townhouse, which he was using after his first arrest. We see what is basically a blackmail harvesting monster set up inside of this house, likely set up with help from people at Carbine. So yes, it seems very likely that Epstein was collecting blackmail information on people and selling it. Now, who could he have potentially collected blackmail on? Who do we know for a fact visited these properties? Well, when it comes to the early 2000s and beyond, I want to introduce you guys to a man named Alfredo Rodriguez. Alfredo Rodriguez was the house butler for that property in Florida that Epstein owned, all the way up until Epstein's first arrest in 2007. Now, Alfredo Rodriguez is also dead, but before he died of mesothelioma, which is a rare cancer, he managed to make a copy of one of the two black books that were found at all of Epstein's properties. And his copy is likely what you've seen out there on the internet. This is the one that we're all familiar with. And if you didn't know, the annotations, the circled names, are all Alfredo's doing. He circled all of those people's names as he thought they were important people for police to investigate, because he was actually arrested in 2010 for trying to sell this book for $50,000 to the prosecutors who wanted it from him. And those prosecutors eventually ended up getting him charged with obstruction of justice for doing that. That's why Alfredo went to jail. But let's take a look at some of the names that Alfredo circled as people who he probably saw coming in and out of that house. We see that he circled the name Alan Dershowitz. Alan Dershowitz is one of the attorneys who helped Epstein originally back in 2007 when he was getting investigated for molesting over 40 little girls. He was also one of the guys that continued to give legal advice to Epstein all the way up until his second arrest in 2019. We also see the former New Mexico governor, Bill Richardson, who was accused by Virginia Giuffre of sexually abusing her. Bill Richardson is also now dead, and we don't really know why. Then we have Courtney Love, who was Kurt Cobain's girlfriend. And if you don't know, the Kurt Cobain thing is still kind of an open case in some people's minds, especially in the mind of the private investigator who was hired by Courtney Love the day after Kurt Cobain went missing. He says that she had something to do with his death. But we're not going to get into that right now. We also see Donald Trump, who, as I'm sure you know, is our current sitting US president, and who is somebody who spent over 10 years being Epstein's best friend from the 90s to the early 2000s. We also have Ehud Barak, former prime minister of Israel. And if you guys didn't know, Epstein was also in close contact with another prime minister of Israel named Benjamin Netanyahu. Kind of interesting how that works, right? We also see a woman named Eva Anderson. Remember Glenn Dubin from earlier, the guy that was accused by Virginia Giuffre and then gave Epstein $15 million? This is now his wife. This is a woman that Epstein dated in the 80s, but then broke up with her, probably because she reached the age of 18, and then she went on to marry Glenn Dubin. We also see Leslie Wexner and Abigail Wexner. It's very interesting just how correct all of these annotations seem to be, given what we know now. It's almost like Alfredo Rodriguez really knew what was going on in that house where he spent all of his time. But Leslie and Abigail Wexner have both been accused by multiple victims of assisting Epstein in his crimes. Many victims have said that they complained to them or their staff at the New York townhouse before it was fully transferred under Epstein's shell corporation, Maple Inc., and they said that there is no way that Abigail and Leslie Wexner couldn't have known that abuse was taking place, given the frequency and the severity of it. So both of them are on the hook as far as I'm concerned. We also have Peter Soros, who is the nephew of George Soros, who of course is a man that is constantly embroiled in all kinds of controversies. The Soros family is quite the dynasty. They have tons of money, and that's why they would have been the perfect targets for a guy like Jeffrey Epstein. They are exactly the kind of people that Epstein was seeking out to fund his lifestyle. Now, what about Epstein's New York townhouse, though? What about the people that visited there? Well, again, we know about the whole thing with Abigail and Leslie Wexner. Those two have a number of allegations against them for allowing things to happen in this house where young women were trying to tell the security guards there, were trying to tell anybody, and these two did absolutely nothing about it. We also have William J. Burns, who was a former director of the CIA. Nobody really knows why William Burns went into Epstein's townhouse. There was some bullshit excuse given about looking to get back into the private sector and coming to Epstein for some kind of financial advice. But what you have to know is that this was after Epstein had already been arrested and convicted for child prostitution. You're telling me the director of the fucking CIA couldn't figure out that he was visiting with a pedophile over 3 times? Give me a fucking break, man. We also have a fixer for Obama, Catherine Rumler. She visited Epstein on multiple occasions and even took flights to other places in the world, including Paris. We still have absolutely no answers as to why Catherine Rumler was meeting with Epstein. But moving on, we actually have definitive proof that Ehud Barak visited Epstein's New York residence at least one time. Here we can see a picture taken by the Daily Mail where Ehud Barak is attempting to enter the house while concealing his identity. Photographers say that they also saw a number of young women enter that house within an hour of Ehud's arrival, which is pretty scary if you think about it. Ehud Barak was a former prime minister and chief of defense of the Israeli armed forces. If you were either collecting blackmail on a guy like that or selling blackmail to a guy like that, that could be extremely dangerous. But we also see that royalty was getting wrapped up in this. We had a photographer/journalist follow Prince Andrew through New York to Epstein's townhouse and then do a little walk around Central Park with Epstein. But aside from the photo, we know for a fact that Prince Andrew has visited Epstein's properties here in the United States because he has said so himself. And for that reason, I peg Prince Andrew at both the Florida residence and the New York residence. And if you've been following the Epstein story at all, you know that Prince Andrew, for a fact, abused children. He was accused by Virginia Giuffre of abusing her back in 2000, and he has lost all of his military and royal titles. I'm not even sure he's a prince over there anymore. That's how serious this is. Another thing I want to show you, though, is this image. This image shows us a few very interesting individuals. I'll start from the left and go to the right. On the very most left, we have Jess Staley. This was Epstein's contact at JP Morgan, and he was also accused of some pretty nasty shit within Epstein's network as well. Then the next guy to the right of Jess Staley is Lawrence Summers. We recently saw just how weird this guy was getting with Epstein over email, talking about how he was basically dooming one of the people he was supposed to be mentoring at Harvard to engage in a romantic and sexual relationship with him. It's like he was trying to corral her into doing these things. And I want to say this too, Lawrence Summers' wife was also emailing Epstein, a known pedophile at this time, about a book called Lolita, in which an old man marries a woman to get access to her daughter, then ends up killing the mother, and then basically just being really weird with the 12-year-old daughter for the rest of the book. Which to me is not a very good conversation to be having with somebody that you know has a proclivity for children like Jeffrey Epstein. Now, just to the right of Jeffrey Epstein, we have Bill Gates, of course. We just talked about him. We know that Epstein was trying to blackmail him as well. And then to the right of Bill Gates, we have Boris Nikolic, who is one of the employees at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. For whatever reason, this Boris Nikolic guy was actually named as the executor in Epstein's will at one point for his entire estate, and nobody really knows why. And now I want to show you guys a clip from Nick Shirley's channel. Most of you know him. As of late, he's been doing some great journalism over in Minnesota. If you ask just about anyone other than Tim Walz, he's actually making quite a difference. But in this instance, he went to Epstein's New York residence, the one I've been talking about, and he actually was able to interview an older woman who has been living there as a neighbor to this property for a number of years. And this is what she had to say.
And did you ever see any really rich and powerful people go inside this building?
You want to know who I saw going in there? Everyone you've heard about.
Really?
Yeah.
Can you name any names?
Yeah, you know them all from the newspaper.
Did you see Bill Clinton going there?
Who?
Bill Clinton?
Yep.
Bill Gates?
No.
Trump?
Yep. I think of the other ones. Andrew.
Prince Andrew. You saw Prince Andrew going there. And
Now that's pretty shocking, right? She says everyone that you've heard about, and then she specifically names Donald Trump and Bill Clinton as people that she has seen enter that townhouse. Now, think back to all the stuff that I just showed you. Our current sitting US president went into this honey trap blackmail den, and only God knows what happened in there while he was staying. But I can assure you, whatever did happen or whatever was said was absolutely recorded and saved on some kind of device. So to sum up the video thus far, we have known connections to intelligence agencies who would be starving to buy this kind of blackmail information. We have known blackmail behavior by Epstein. We know he was engaging in this. We know that he knew how useful this kind of information was, which would make him a great salesman of this blackmail information. Now we know that Epstein was always doing this. This was always a part of his plan. We have the first generation with cassette recorders and micro CDs and stuff like that, and then the second generation with help from Carbine to set up a massive blackmail harvesting network. And now we see just how many very prominent people, some of whom are leading our country, went to Epstein's properties, both the Florida property and the New York property, where every little thing they did or said was very likely recorded and saved. And so finally, I want to end this video by answering one last question. Do we see evidence of compromising material, potentially collected by Jeffrey Epstein or other people even, being used against someone like Donald Trump, for example, who once again is our current sitting US president? And my answer to that is yes. When it comes to Israel, remember, we have Stephen Hoffenberg telling us that Epstein was in direct line of communication with Mossad, which is their intelligence agency. We have Donald Trump completely tarnishing the reputation of the United States as a mediator figure in the Middle East by handing over the Golan Heights, ripping it away from Syria and handing it to Israel, something that we never would have done 10 to 20 years ago. We also see that under Donald Trump, Israel swapped its capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is one of the most holy sites in the Muslim world and has long been considered as neutral territory. Donald Trump came in and said, nope, guys, sorry, that belongs to Israel now. And now anyone coming through the West Bank or anywhere else in the world has to get these little ID cards and basically bow down to the government of Israel to get any access, which again goes against the grain of being a mediator figure. We are 100% now showing favoritism towards Israel. But let's move on to another subject now. How about that guy that came over here from Israel, the cybersecurity guy from the government of Israel who works directly under Benjamin Netanyahu, who went to Vegas for a conference on cryptocurrency and tried to meet up with a 15-year-old girl? This guy literally got caught up in a sex sting, just like the Chris Hansen shit, and then they just let him go back to Israel. Why the fuck would you do that? It's so obvious that this guy would be a flight risk. Why would you let him out of the jail? And supposedly, this guy has a hearing in March, but we'll see how that goes. It doesn't actually seem like the Nevada state government or the federal government gives a fuck at all about what's going on with that. I actually suggest you do your own research into that whole thing because it is extremely fucked up. I don't know how you come here from a foreign country, try to meet up with somebody underage, and leave. It honestly makes me wonder if there are potentially some very powerful people in our government who have an attraction to minors, and therefore sympathize with people like Alexandrovich.
Your daughter She's beautiful.
Can I say this? A piece of ass.
Yeah.
She looks more voluptuous than ever.
She's actually always been very voluptuous.
God, every time I hear that, it's just fucking disgusting. But if we're going to talk about Trump and Israel, I might as well also mention that Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is in deep with the Israeli government. He's actually good friends with Benjamin Netanyahu, and he got his daughter Ivanka Trump, the one he was just referencing, to convert to Judaism, which is interesting to me given how Trump says that he's the biggest Christian on the planet. And Jared Kushner, by the way, is the guy that tried to broker that deal with Palestine, the deal of the century, which they absolutely loved, but I'm not going to get into that right now either. Let's move on to Russia. What do we see with Russia? Well, when it comes to Russia, there's at least one interesting event that took place. And to the media, it's called the infamous Trump Tower meeting, where Donald Trump met with two Russians, one of which was named Rinat Akhmetshin. This guy is actually a Soviet counterintelligence officer. And why a guy like this would want to be meeting with Donald Trump, before he was even president, mind you, is completely beyond me, but he did. And the other Russian that was in that meeting was a lawyer named Natalia Veselnitskaya. This is her here. And while she was here in the United States, she actually got hit with charges of falsifying documents. She forged false correspondence on behalf of Russia and presented it to the United States as if it were official. They tried to charge her, but somehow, just like Tom Alexandrovich, she got away. And I'm over here kind of just wondering why you would let that happen. Why would you let this person just go back to Russia? And what were they even talking about in the meeting? Nobody knows what was going on in that meeting. Were they potentially discussing what Trump was going to do for them because they had blackmail material? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. Let's move on to China, though. Does anyone remember that Chinese spy that came over here, the People's Republic of China intelligence civilian, who ended up sleeping with a whole bunch of our politicians, committing espionage every single day, and then she was also allowed to just go back to China? Why would they let her go back? What did she know? The government even admitted there were some very, very sensitive people that were caught up with Christine Fang. And we just let her go back and spill the beans to her Chinese overlords. That's fucking great. Why did they allow that to happen? Because when somebody's committing espionage, you just detain them. You don't tip them off and then let them run away. It doesn't make any fucking sense, but that's what we're doing. And we're starting to kind of see a pattern here, right, guys? These people who come over here commit crimes, they're part of intelligence, they're part of foreign governments, they get off the hook. Why is that? Why is that? Okay, let's move on to Saudi Arabia now. I'm bringing up Saudi Arabia because we know that Epstein had a passport for Saudi Arabia. They tried to say this was fake, but the government even admitted that the passport contained legitimate ingress and egress stamps, indicating that it was used to enter countries in Europe and the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia. Now, what do we see when it comes to Saudi Arabia? Well, we see that Donald Trump seems to have a fascination with Mohammed bin Salman, who is the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. This is the guy that ordered the killing of a journalist who was trying to expose all the fraud in the war with Yemen, which is a conflict that is also heavily being funded by the United States, mainly by Donald Trump, as everyone else around Donald Trump seems to think it's a bad idea. But this guy literally went into a consulate in Turkey and tried to get a marriage license. And then he was jumped by a bunch of assassins and he was cut into pieces and carried out in suitcases. And for some reason, the guy who ordered that attack, Mohammed bin Salman, is now cutting deals in the White House. Why? Why are we allowing this to happen? Ask any intelligence agency out there. They'll tell you that this guy ordered the murder of this journalist. He is literally suppressing free speech. That is not American. Why are we helping him? Why are we bowing down to this guy? Why are we inviting him to the White House? And when it comes to that conflict in Yemen that Donald Trump seems so adamant in supporting, I want to show you guys why it's such a bad idea. First of all, it's not going anywhere. The conflict has been in a stalemate situation for years now. But even though it's in a stalemate, it's literally causing hundreds of thousands of deaths. Half the population is facing extreme food insecurity, and millions of Yemenis are unable to meet their basic needs. And it is all because of this conflict that we perpetuate by funding them. Even the people in Donald Trump's own administration, back in his first term, were wondering, why the fuck are you doing this? Why the fuck did you veto a bill that would end support for this pointless war? None of this makes sense, okay? And that's where I'll wrap up the little point about, yes, we are seeing behaviors that could be caused by blackmail potentially. We are bending over for these foreign countries, and I don't know why. Nobody knows why. All of this stuff is bullshit and shouldn't be happening. We should not be allowing people to come here and commit crimes and then simply leave. Espionage is serious. We don't know what Christine Fang left off to China with. That should never have happened. We shouldn't be allowing pedophiles like Tom Alexandrovich to leave the country either. He tried to meet up with a teenager here in the United States and have sex with her. Why are we letting that go? And so I guess I'll end just by summing up the whole video. Epstein did have intelligence connections. He did know people who would buy blackmail material. Epstein did blackmail people. He did know the value of blackmail material. Epstein did have blackmail harvesting setups. Epstein did acquire and use all of the technology required to harvest blackmail within his properties. He did it in Florida, he did it in New York. Anything in those properties would have been audio and video recorded. And I still don't know why we don't have an updated list for what they seized at any of his other properties. They won't give us any of that stuff. They're keeping it secret. Give us the lists of seized items that were seized by the FBI for these other properties. At this point, it is illegal not to do that. And then we see that a whole bunch of people went to these properties. Alfredo Rodriguez saw a whole bunch at the Florida property, and we know from various sources that a bunch of other people, especially people in the government, went to Epstein's New York property. Donald Trump specifically seems to have made an appearance at both properties, which to me is pretty fucking scary considering that yes, we are now seeing blackmail type behaviors. We are now seeing Donald Trump commit to the well-being of other countries while we bend over backwards for them. While we let their criminals come here, commit crimes, which was like the whole thing that we weren't supposed to do, although I guess maybe it's okay if you're an intelligence agent for another country, and none of it makes any goddamn sense. Does it make sense to you to be letting these criminals go? Or maybe does it make more sense that he's being compelled by some kind of material that these other countries purchased from Epstein, that they were sent by Epstein, that was packed up at his New York townhouse or maybe even his Florida mansion and then sent to them through the mail, or potentially handed off to somebody that was originally here in the United States but went back to one of these countries? I'm telling you right now, guys, this is some scary shit. And this is probably the scariest aspect to the Epstein story. Because just imagine what happens over time if we allow this to continue. What happens if Donald Trump or anyone else in our government specifically has blackmail material being employed against them? I think we all know what happens if that kind of shit gets out into the public eye. These people will be ripped apart. They will all be thrown in prison. It'll be a bloodbath. Just put yourself in that position for a second and think about what you would do to keep that kind of shit from coming out about you. Is this potentially why we're seeing so much unprecedented behavior within the government? Could this just be a fraction of the reason why? I personally think so. And for all these reasons, I don't think it's unreasonable to believe that this might be going on. In fact, I think this is very likely what's going on. And that's where I'm going to leave things off. So thank you for staying to the end of this video. Thank you for informing yourself, and I will see you in the next video.